Hello and welcome to everyone who's just joining us for this webinar. I will be getting started in about 1 minute to let a few more folks trickle in, but we warmly welcome you and thank you so much for joining us today. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I would say it's great to see you, but you know how these things go. So I do know, however, that 150 people registered for the event. So we're really appreciative of all the interest and looking forward to our amazing guests and your engagement during this session. I'm Rachel Doran, Director of Policy and Strategy at Clean Energy Canada. Clean Energy Canada is a program of the Centre for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, British Columbia, located on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. So we, as I said, are very excited to have you join us today to talk about a policy area that is seeing a lot of attention at the moment. By Buy Clean, we mean a set of policies aimed at using the government's own public infrastructure spending to grow the market for low carbon materials. Now, Buy Clean is definitely having a moment right now. The appeal is that it both allows a reduction in the carbon footprint of government spending, but it also creates ripple effects and produces a market signal to promote lower carbon materials more broadly. That explains that in the past 6 months, we've seen federal commitments and action from both the Canadian and US governments, as well as legislation in 5 states. So, given the fact that some jurisdictions in the US are well advanced on this issue, we at Clean Energy Canada decided to interview a number of the key players behind Buy Clean policies in the US to understand what worked, what didn't, lessons we can learn here in Canada as we develop our own national policy. The result is our new report, Lessons from the United States on Buying Clean and Recommendations for Canada. My colleague Felix Witten will start today's discussion off by running through our main findings. But first, I would like to introduce our special guests who will pop up after Felix's presentation and who are all experts in the field. Joining us from the US, you'll see we have Senator Chris Hansen from Colorado, Meghan Lewis, Senior Researcher at the Carbon Leadership Forum in Seattle, Washington, and Jordan Palmeri, an environmental scientist and policy advisor at the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. And to bring a Canadian perspective, we are delighted to welcome back Sarah Petrevan, formerly of Clean Energy Canada and now Director of Sustainability with the Cement Association of Canada. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We look forward to hearing from you during a moderated panel discussion after Felix's presentation. Before we start, it's my job just to run through a few quick housekeeping matters. All participants will be muted throughout the webinar, but if you do have any technical issues or questions at any time, you can ask our senior communications help troubleshoot them by using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You may need to move your mouse over the screen or down to the bottom in order to see that menu. And you'll want to be able to find the menu and the Q&A icon because we will also be welcoming your questions at any time throughout the webinar submitted through that same Q&A function. We'll be compiling your questions for our guests to respond to in the final 20 minutes of the webinar. We will be recording the speakers and will circulate a copy of the recording and a copy of the slides to all who registered. Please feel free to share widely, including on social media. And finally, if you do want to stay informed about Buy Clean, as well as all things clean energy, then make sure you sign up to Clean Energy Canada's weekly newsletter, the Clean Energy Review. We'll make sure to circulate a link for that too in the email. So if you are just joining us now, thank you so much for participating. I'm Rachel Doran, Director of Policy and Strategy at Clean Energy Canada. And now I'll turn things over to Felix, our Senior Policy Advisor, for a brief summary of our recent report.
Thanks very much, Rachel. And it's great to be here with you all today. Let me just get my screen shared. So in the interest of time, I'm going to run through this presentation as quickly as possible. If people have questions, you're welcome to ask them during the Q&A towards the end of the webinar. So what is Buy Clean? As Rachel kind of alluded to at the beginning, Buy Clean is an approach to public spending that prioritizes low carbon and sustainable materials in roads, bridges, hospitals, and other infrastructure. Buy Clean policies generally have two main goals. First, improving disclosure of the carbon emissions embodied in construction materials. And second is reducing these emissions over time. When I talk about embodied carbon, what I'm talking about is the extraction, manufacturing, construction, transportation, and end of life, all the emissions associated with those processes. And in total, those can account for up to 50% of the emissions over the lifetime of a building. So, these are critical to reducing these emissions if we're going to meet our net zero goals. And why do we focus on construction materials? Well, for a couple of reasons. First, we use a lot of these materials since they are the building blocks of our infrastructure. For example, every year the world uses 30 billion, with a B, tons of concrete and 2 billion tons of steel. These materials are also highly carbon intensive to produce. The cement and steel sectors together account for around 15% of global emissions. That's more than any single country, apart from China. So if we're serious about net zero, we need to change the way we produce and use these materials. Until fairly recently, this issue had received less attention compared to other sectors like transportation and electricity that are considered easier to decarbonize. However, this is beginning to change. Governments, thanks to their enormous purchasing power, have an important role to play in this. In Canada, the public sector is the largest buyer of construction materials, purchasing about $5 billion worth every year. Collectively, this gives governments enormous leverage. The public sector accounts for almost 1/3 of the Canadian market for cement, concrete, and steel, for example. Buy Clean also offers an opportunity to align our infrastructure spending with our climate goals. The federal government over the next 5 years, is planning to invest $160 billion in infrastructure. And provinces such as Ontario are also planning similarly large investments. With a Buy Clean approach, this spending can reduce emissions while at the same time building up our critical infrastructure. So how can we capture this opportunity? Well, first I should note, Canada already has taken a number of key steps. These include committing to a national Buy Clean strategy and mandate letters, joining with several other nations at COP26 in November with a promise to buy low carbon steel and concrete, as well as the ongoing efforts by the Centre for Greening Government and the National Research Council to develop policies, targets, and data to inform a Buy Clean approach. And Budget 2022 provided additional funding to accelerate these efforts and link them to federal policy. So we have some of the building blocks in place here, but we believe Canada can and should be doing more. To understand what that looked like, we decided to look to our neighbors to the south. The Buy Clean concept originated in California in 2017, and since then has spread to at least 18 other states and cities. And since coming to power, the Biden administration has moved quickly to mobilize the spending power of the US federal government. This includes establishing a task force with key government agencies to develop a Buy Clean program, publishing low carbon standards for concrete and asphalt, and supporting pilot projects for federal highways and ports. Given how closely integrated our economies are, and the importance of the US as a Canadian export destination, these efforts are worth paying attention to. So with this in mind, we spent the early part of this year talking to a number of policy experts from across the US. These include policymakers, government officials, researchers, and advocates who work to develop and implement Buy Clean policy. Some of these you will hear from after me. Based on our interviews, we drilled down to 6 key lessons that we think should inform Canada's approach to Buy Clean. Lesson 1 is start simple. This could mean focusing on a subset of high impact materials or a few infrastructure types. For example, several jurisdictions, including New York, New Jersey, and the city of Portland, have focused on concrete, given its widespread use in public projects and large carbon footprint. From a political viewpoint, as this quote from one of our interviewees shows, targeting your policy can also make the journey a smoother one. The second lesson is about the importance of engaging industry and other stakeholders. As the quote below shows, embodied carbon and buy clean policy is a new concept for many people in government and in the private sector. As such, designing an effective policy is as much about managing changes in culture and behavior as it is about technical standards or data. Our report highlights several examples of effective engagement in places like Portland and Colorado. Lesson 3 is to collect enough data to be able to make informed decisions. Good stakeholder engagement can help with this. Several people we spoke to worked closely with industry and procurement staff to gather lifecycle data and develop carbon benchmarks. This resulted in greater industry buy-in and better compliance. However, many of our interviewees warned us not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good when it comes to data. As Jordan, one of our guests today, told me, we don't have 10 years to develop the perfect database covering all materials. Sometimes we need to start with what we have. And in many cases, that's good enough to make informed decisions. The fourth lesson is to actually, after collecting data, to start reducing emissions. We highlight 2 ways to do this, and it's important to note these are not mutually exclusive. The first, used by California and several other states, is the stick approach. This sets a limit on embodied carbon for materials, and only products that can demonstrate they fall below this limit are eligible for public projects. The second approach is the carrot. This uses incentives, such as adding points or applying discounts during the bidding process, or alternatively attaching a performance bonus, which can be applied at the end of the project. All of these steps above require leadership and coordination. Therefore, it's vital to have policy champions for Buy Clean, people who can communicate effectively, bring others together, and stay the course. During the discussion today, you'll hear from 2 such champions. Senator Chris Hansen from Colorado, who led the successful Buy Clean Act in his state, and Jordan Palmeri, who played a key role behind the scenes in Oregon's Buy Clean policy. This chart shows the importance in Canada of federal leadership. With almost 90% of our procurement and infrastructure spending at a sub-national level, this makes Canada among the most decentralized of any developed country, according to the OECD. As with carbon pricing, the federal government has a unique role to play here in bringing provinces to the table, setting consistent standards, and providing financial and technical support to other levels of government. And finally, lesson 6 is to connect the dots between Buy Clean and industrial policy. Getting heavy industry to net zero requires both demand and supply signals. Buy Clean can boost the public sector demand for cleaner materials, but we also need policies that address the private sector, that invest directly in research and development and in scaling up low carbon industrial solutions, and use carbon pricing and trade rules to level the playing field. So with that, I'll leave you with this quote from one of our interviewees, Mike Williams, who actually coined the term Buy Clean back in 2016. Buy Clean is not only a climate policy, it can also be seen as a way to support clean jobs and competitive industry as the world transitions to a net zero economy. Thank you for listening. And now I'll pass over to my colleague, Ollie, who can lead off our panel discussion.
Great, thanks so much, Felix. It was a great summary. And of course, there's a lot more detail in the report itself. So we encourage you all to dive into that if you have the chance. So switching gears now, we're going to turn to our panel to explore some of the lessons in a bit more detail. And again, I'd just like to thank them all for taking their time to speak today. We really appreciate the expertise and the experience that you bring to this policy area. So I'll be starting with a few questions, and then we'll be putting some attendees' questions to the panel a bit later on at around 10:40. So if you do have questions, get them in the chat and we will get to them later. So with that, let's get started. So to begin with, it would be great if each of you could just take a couple of minutes to tell us about your experiences with BuyClean in your role. So perhaps we could start with Senator Hansen, and then we'll move to Meghan, then Jordan, and finish off with Sarah. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Ollie. Yeah, really great to be with everyone today. A very warm hello from Denver, Colorado. We are just finishing up our work at the state legislature, and I wanted to describe really two parts to the effort that we've done in Colorado. The first one I passed last year, the BuyClean legislation that basically put in place an EPD review process by our state architect, who kind of runs and coordinates all of our state procurement on infrastructure, new buildings, both vertical and for roads and bridges, so vertical and horizontal construction. Our state architect reviews those EPDs, sets the level to qualify for procurement incentives, and we disproportionately now are using state procurement to use and use those products in all of our public projects. So very similar to what Felix described, that is in law now in Colorado. The second thing that we did, and a follow-up that I just passed a few days ago, Senate Bill 51 in Colorado, it really tries to expand that idea to the private sector. So we're using a carrot approach, always easier to use carrots than sticks in legislation. And so we have essentially canceled the state sales tax on steel, concrete and cement, drywall, gypsum board, flat glass are some of the categories that we look at. And if you qualify for the low emission product, you don't have to pay state sales tax when you procure those for private projects. So now we've got something in place that gives that procurement edge on the public sector projects, but we've also now expanded it with a tax incentive on the private side. And so we're really hoping to see a huge growth in this. And we've got steel and cement manufacturing in Colorado, probably like all of our jurisdictions. And this is a really great way to contrast from products that are coming from further away or from localities where there's a lot more embedded carbon. That was mentioned nicely, I think, in the report, with contrasting with China, Russia, India, et cetera. And so this also has a great kind of local economic development story to it as well. So that was a big part of our success in Colorado, was tying it into some of the local businesses. And I think that really helped us get it into the statute books. So look forward to the rest of this discussion, and glad I could share a few of the things that we've done in Colorado. Thanks, Ollie.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. My name is Meghan Lewis, and I'm a senior researcher at the Carbon Leadership Forum at the University of Washington. We're a research organization based out of the Department of Architecture at UW and the state of Washington, not in Washington, DC. And I've been leading the Carbon Leadership Forum's policy research since I joined, and we have done a lot of research on embodied carbon policies like BuyClean. Before joining the CLF, I was an architect, and so it's been really exciting to see some of the work that I tried to do in practice in terms of reducing embodied carbon really spreading to a much broader group of people that are trying to work on this, and as well to policy. At the CLF, I've led development of our policy toolkit, which includes a number of primers on BuyClean, as well as several deeper reports that dive into some of the issues around BuyClean, like different types of EPDs, setting limits like those that were set in California recently, how to implement BuyClean. Jordan and I co-authored a report this year on that. And then a lot of where I spend my time talking about BuyClean is just answering questions from legislators, from advocacy organizations, from groups like Clean Energy Canada. And there are a lot of questions about EPDs and LCA from stakeholders in every state that you saw on that great map. And so, yeah, excited to join the panel today and continue to talk about BuyClean.
Great. Hi, everybody. How are you? Thanks so much for inviting me. My name is Jordan Palmeri, and I am a staff member in the Built Environment program at the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. So my experience with BuyClean policies started with our work to help develop concrete EPDs across the state of Oregon. Way back in 2016, we actually surveyed a bunch of businesses and asked them how government might help assist with integrating life cycle assessment into the work that they do. And they responded by saying we need technical and financial assistance. So that helped us kick off a program with our state concrete industry association from 2017 to 2020. And we basically worked with concrete producers across the state to help get EPDs out on the market. The program was largely successful in that we got over 1,500 EPDs out on the market. And now we're working with people across the state to actually use those EPDs to lower the carbon footprint of their concrete. We also saw, parallel paths for legislation and other local buy clean policies over that time period. We, along with California, saw our first buy clean legislation in 2017 at the state level. It did not pass. We saw it again in 2021, and then it finally did pass in 2022, just recently. Oregon is a little unique in that we're one of the states that our buy clean law exclusively focuses on state transportation projects. So we're just starting to digest this since it passed recently. I've also worked really closely with the city of Portland. They've been requiring concrete EPDs since January of 2020, and they're about to set carbon limits over the next couple of weeks, and those will be enforceable by January 1st of 2023. So that's some of my experience working with Buy Clean. Thanks so much.
And I get the last word. I'm Sarah Petrevan, Director of Sustainability for the Cement Association of Canada. So my work on, my history on Buy Clean in Canada is long but varied. So I've been working on Buy Clean in Canada for probably the past 7 to 8 years. And my initial foray into the topic was really as a policy expert and a policy advisor during my time when I used to work at Clean Energy Canada. I really started our work in Buy Clean and led our engagement on policies such as the federal greening government strategy, engagement on with a couple of different provinces on what Buy Clean policy might look like for them, and then continuing to lobby and engage with the federal government on trying to get a national approach to a Buy Clean policy, and have authored numerous papers in Canada working with a number of environmental and partners in other industries. But now my time at the Cement Association continue to be a lobbyist and advocate for Buy Clean policy, particularly working in a much more detailed way with government on how this could be realized for our industry. I think as Felix mentioned in his initial presentation, it's great. Like, we are working very, very hard to decarbonize our industry and have developed, or in the process of developing, our net zero 2050 roadmap, which, unlike any other industry, will contain detailed modeling and numbers on how we plan to get there. But for us, and I think for other industries in Canada, while we're being asked to decarbonize, and we're pleased and proud to be doing so, there also needs to be a market for the lower carbon products that we produce. And right now, building that market is a challenge. And so, certainly not only public procurement, but codes and standards, specifically as they speak to the private market, are really a transformative way to not only create market for these low carbon materials that we're creating, but actually also to help us nationally reduce our GHG emissions through using materials that have less embodied carbon. So really excited to be here and really excited to continue to engage in the conversation.
Great. Thank you all so much for those responses. It's clearly a real breadth of experience on Buy Clean on this panel. So let's dive into a couple of takeaways. So unfortunately, Senator Hansen, we know you have to leave a little early. So I'll start with a question for you. As lesson 5 in our report highlights, one thing that's really clear from successful Buy Clean initiatives that we looked at is the presence of strong policy champions. So that's both politicians and inside government. Could you tell us a little bit more, perhaps, about some of the challenges that you faced in Colorado in that regard and how you navigated them?
Yeah, thanks, Ollie. Like anyone on the call who's familiar with the legislative process knows how messy it can be, kind of by design, I suppose. And I think the key in Colorado was really, as I foreshadowed earlier, was to try to make sure we had a lot of folks engaged early and behind the policy. And so really tried to build a coalition early in the process before the session even started. We've got some very large, steel and manufacturing facilities in Colorado. So reached out to management and their policy people, but also to the organized labor that is part of those facilities. And that was really a powerful 1-2 kind of combination when it came to the policy debate, and really talking about why this was good for Colorado. It wasn't just certainly there's that audience for let's reduce emissions. I'm a Democrat. I represent a very blue city here in Denver, and they were excited about the carbon message. But we also needed to really engage organized labor and industry and talk about the economic benefits for the less progressive parts of the state. And I think it was that combination of kind of bringing those different elements together that got us where we needed to politically. And then we could really focus in on how do we create an easy to implement policy. And I think we ended up in the right spot in Colorado with those various elements.
Great, thank you. Jordan, Meghan, I don't know whether from an inside, the sort of departmental perspective, you have anything to add in terms of being that sort of presence and being that sort of strong policy champion.
I'm looking at you.
Sure, I'll take a shot. I think it's I think it's really important to have policy champions at the staff level. I mean, we're talking about government purchasing here, and one thing I do when I'm working with other state agencies or even local governments who are starting to develop Buy Clean is just to find the person who has the most interest or aptitude with the topic, and just spend a little bit more time educating them on what the opportunities are and how they might be able to accomplish them, whether it be at a state level or a local level. And you'll often find someone with a lot of excitement and enthusiasm for the topic, because it's often one of those things that's a light bulb moment. They're like, oh, wow, I didn't realize that I had no information on the carbon footprint of all these materials that I'm buying. Like, that just seems like basic information I should have. And so you'll often be able to motivate someone at the staff level to be that champion. And sometimes I've worked with sustainability staff, policy staff, engineers. Sometimes I think engineers on staff really take to this because they're technically minded and they like getting down in the details. So sometimes I find staff engineers like to step up to the plate.
Thank you. It's really.
And Ollie, I'll just one quick thing to add to that, and I should out myself. I'm an engineer by background, so maybe that was why I was so drawn to this in the first place. And kind of have done infrastructure projects in my private sector career before entering politics, and done infrastructure projects all over the world. So this was I felt like kind of a home base, and it really helped me when I was talking to my colleagues about the different ideas that are out there. And I can't finish a call with Canadians without saying my favorite Canadian word in politics, which is riding. So I want everyone to know I have a very progressive blue riding in Denver, and did my best to represent them on this policy. And I think that worked also in some of the more conservative ridings where they were more interested in the jobs. So that those are really the elements that I think can be powerful together.
Thank you so much. And Senator, if you have those last couple of minutes, we've had a question on the chat. It'd be great if you had a view on, which is, do you see any opportunity to bypass the legislative process to move faster via, say, executive order from the governor's office?
Yeah, I mean, that certainly is an option. Of course, every state has different limitations on what executive orders can and can't do, and the same at the U.S. federal level. I would say, we could have done some of this in Colorado with an executive order, but much of what we've done, like on the tax policy change, required legislation to set up this office and fund it inside the state architect's office. That required legislation. So, it's much better, I think, if you can get a statutory framework and have the appropriations ready for this work to be done. Is, I think, much more sustainable and long lasting than if you do it with an executive order, which may get you started. So that might be a good place to get going. But I think you'd quickly want to move to legislation so that you'd cover those other bases.
And we've
Great,
actually
thanks so much.
there are 3 or 4 states in the U.S. that have called out Buy Clean like goals in executive orders to focus on embodied carbon through their procurement, and it just hasn't, because of all the reasons that Senator Hansen mentioned, it hasn't created as much change as having the legislative framework in place.
Brilliant. Well, again, thank you so much, Senator. I really appreciate your time. I know you have to go, so just thanks again, and appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I'm sorry I got to get back to the Capitol here, but it was great to be with you, and thanks for including me. Appreciate it.
So we'll loop back actually all the way back to lesson 1, which, to remind everyone, was to start simple and increase ambition over time. Meghan, if we could start with you on this one. Why is this so important, and what are some of the ways that government can keep things manageable while still having that obviously desired impact on emissions?
Yeah, thanks. I think so. In terms of why it's important, the first thing is just that embodied carbon is still a new concept to many audiences. So despite the fact that industrial emissions are the largest single source of global end-use greenhouse gas emissions, seeing the tie between those emissions and the built environment isn't always obvious. And that's something that there's still a lot of education and awareness happening on this topic. But so we need time to build capacity to understand and also to address and reduce that. But then, as Felix pointed out, and I love that quote, Jordan, I mean, we don't have time to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So we need to be able to, and that's why I think the starting simple is so important, because we recognize the need to build capacity, but at the same time, we have to get started. And so the best way to address that is to be able to start smaller. And so what we see that meaning is starting with a smaller number of materials that have a really high carbon impact, and then increasing that list over time. So the 2 most common that are included, well, I'll actually say the number 2 could be confusing here, depending on how you account for products. So starting with, structural steel and rebar in terms of steel products, and then concrete and cement. Starting with those 2 groups of materials is really important. We're also starting to see, I'd say the next most common are asphalt, wood, insulation, and glass. We're also starting to see in a lot of policies. But again, starting with a small list and growing over time, and then starting with disclosure. So starting by requiring EPDs and then phasing in targets or other elements of the policy over time can give time for the agency to build capacity to actually collect and track that data, to understand how to set the limits, to make sure there's enough data to set those limits, while you're at the same time educating the stakeholders that are needed to actually implement these policies.
Thank you. And I don't know if Sarah or Jordan, you have anything to add on that one, or if not, we can move on to the next question.
Maybe I'll just add and say, like, part of the challenge and maybe just to support the why you want to start small and scale up is particularly when you start getting into like cement and concrete procurement, you also have to overcome the barrier of, I guess we'll just call it like architects and engineers who are concerned about other considerations in maintaining the integrity of the infrastructure that they're building, and really working with, and there's a huge role for education to understand that like a lower carbon concrete doesn't necessarily mean that you're sacrificing resiliency or longevity or the structural security and safety of the material. You know, that is definitely something that we've come up across in Canada, because you have no shortage of industry will. You know, we've got the Buy Clean Alliance in Canada, which is made up of a bunch of the industrial groups, a couple of environmental partners led by Clean Energy Canada, and then also participation from labor. So you definitely have the coalition of the willing. I think part of the challenge on our side, at least in Canada, comes from the education about the structural resiliency of low carbon materials and how lower carbon you can still maintain performance.
Yeah, that's certainly something that we've come across in the report, and Felix uncovered in some of his interviews. So thank you so much for that, both of you. Jordan, I'm going to turn to you and put you on the spot a little for this next one, which is the third lesson, and it's something that you spoke to a lot in your interview with Felix, is this need to collect good enough data on material life cycle emissions to help make those decisions. So I just wondered if you could just tell us a little bit more about this. What are some of the potential pitfalls that we might find in trying to collect that perfect data?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Ollie. I think, you know, the worst pitfall I'd say in trying to collect the perfect data is delaying policy and project level decisions because of data uncertainty. You know, as Meghan said, we really don't have much time to waste here with respect to mitigating emissions. So we really do need to act now. Unfortunately, the argument for better or perfect data comes from everybody, right? Who doesn't want better data, right? It's the scientists, it's the policymakers, it's the engineers, it's the material manufacturers, and you can't blame them, you know, who doesn't want better data. But the thing that I find it really helpful to remind people of is just where we are today, right? For the overwhelming majority of construction materials, we have absolutely zero information about the carbon footprint. And so just getting these EPDs out on the market, even if there is data variability, it is really a huge step forward from where we were just a couple of years ago. So the other thing about you know, perfect data is that I think one thing that's unique about Buy Clean is that the policy in and of itself is driving better data quality through a couple of different ways. You know, I spend a lot of time on concrete, and I've seen sort of policy drive better data quality because as a policy is on the horizon and we see implementation phases coming, we're seeing more and more supply chain specific data within the supply chain of concrete coming out because it's in the interest of folks with the lower carbon ingredients within concrete to actually measure and disclose that information. So we're seeing more and more cement EPDs, for instance, come out on the market as more people are paying attention to concrete because we know cement is a critically important ingredient associated with the carbon footprint. And another way I think Buy Clean policy is driving better data quality is just through the design of the policy. You know, you heard Meghan talk about this. We have really long lead times, right? First, we're disclosing, then we're going to disclose for 1 to 2 to 3 years, and then we're not actually setting limits for 2 to 3 years down the road. So in the world of life cycle assessment and EPDs, these things only last for 5 years. So and often we see people redoing their analysis in timeframes that are shorter than 5 years because they're making process improvements and want to show those improvements. So I'll say one more thing and sort of give you an example of how we've seen data quality issues play out. You know, the city of Portland's been requiring concrete EPDs since January of 2020. You know, they're not going to have enforceable limits until January 2023. However, there's been a lot happening in these 3 years. And one of the things that we see happen is that once project teams actually select a concrete producer, they're then using those EPDs from an individual producer to select lower carbon mixes. And in terms of data quality, we know that within a single producer, there's a lot of internal consistency and reliability. So we know mix A has a 30% lower carbon footprint than mix B. And that is reliable when you're looking at EPDs from just a single manufacturer. So at a project level, we're still able to make directionally relevant decisions with the type of data we already have on the market. So that's why I encourage people to just move forward with this because we have a lot of available data to do so right now.
I'll just add one thing to that. I think one of the things that always shocks me just how rapidly the larger number of EPDs that are available now compared to, let's say, when Buy Clean California was passed in 2017, there was about 5,000 EPDs available. And now the most recent numbers in EC3 I saw were 90,000. And a lot of those are for concrete, and we don't need to get into the weeds of why those numbers. Anyway, if you don't see 90,000 steel EPDs, that's not a problem. Is the short version of what I would say. But there's just there's been so much growth on this over the last 5 years. And so, as Jordan highlighted, so if you think about something like Buy Clean Colorado that was passed there, so in 3 years, I think is the first time that limits would be implemented on projects. And it's only been 5 years since we've had that amount of increase in EPD availability for some of the products that are in that policy. And who knows where we're going to be even in just 3 years, 5 years before the implementation of that starts in terms of data availability. And that is all the change that has happened in the last 5 years. There was no federal Buy Clean task force that was starting to look at this. We're seeing way more tools now being developed to accelerate the ability and make it easier and more affordable for manufacturers to create EPDs. And a lot of those changes are happening because policies like Buy Clean, both in public sector, but also companies asking for this kind of data, are really inspiring that change. And so I think it would be, again, the biggest issue with that is if you're using data as an excuse to delay policy, you're just further delaying the availability of data.
Great, thanks so much, Meghan and Jordan, on that. And I think there's a lot of positive, positivity in the pace that some of the data can be collected and be produced, which is great. So before I turn over to some of the audience questions, I just want to give Sarah again a bit of a final word, which is, and I think you touched on this a little bit in your response earlier, but based on, obviously you're very well, briefed and researched on this topic, and there's obviously some things you've heard today, but how do you think Canada's approach compares to the US when it comes to Buy Clean? Sort of, what do you think we're doing right? What could we change based on some of the lessons that we've brought up in this report and from your own experiences?
Yeah, so Canada does a lot of things right. We've got a very robust green and government strategy, which commits to starting to collect data on embodied carbon in public construction projects, and then commitments to reduce the levels of embodied carbon over time. And that's a great start. Canada also has done really well in terms of engaging all of the different industry stakeholders in the National Resource Council's life cycle assessment initiative. Industry themselves, along with Clean Energy Canada, have also organized themselves really well to push for this policy. And, I think that that's something that you haven't necessarily, at least in the history of Buy Clean in the US, didn't always see. You didn't always have as much industry alignment, I think, as you see in Canada. One thing that's tricky for us compared to the United States is just really around like the role of public procurement. And at a national level, the United States government is just larger. They buy more, they have a much more substantial largesse to them. And so when the US federal government says, even through executive order, we're going to start doing things on Buy Clean, the amount of the market that it shifts is so substantial that it actually creates change. Whereas in Canada, not as much. And so in Canada, we need to be more deliberate about using some of those carrots that were brought up to really bring along provincial action in this regard, because that is where most of the infrastructure dollars is spent. And then I think the other thing that you have to do in Canada that maybe differs slightly from the United States is really the focus on codes and standards, particularly building codes and standards around materials, right? Now, master national specifications and what kind of materials are appropriate to be used when, and really ingraining measurement of embodied carbon into all of these processes. I think one of the challenges we have in Canada is that the need to reduce embodied carbon as part of the codes and standards system hasn't necessarily trickled down beyond a hypothetical policy level. I think, in the upper level of decision making, I think everyone in Canada well understands the importance of Buy Clean, both from an emissions reductions perspective, but also from an economic perspective. I think the challenge in Canada, frankly, comes down to where the rubber hits the road, in really doing the heavy lifting around changing procurement policy, changing codes and standards policy. That's where we really seem to be. Stuck. And so that's one of the areas where I think we could really benefit from looking to some of the lessons from the United States.
Great, thank you, Sarah. That was incredibly useful context as always. So we're going to move now to some of the questions we've had in the chat, and there's been quite a few, so apologies up front. We're not going to get to all of them, I don't think, but I'm going to start with one around how we engage different associations, different organizations, different industries. So the question is, in research, or in the research that I've conducted, are there many examples of sort of wary or sort of apprehensive industries that needed to be really overcome to engage on Buy Clean? And are there any sort of specific lessons that we can take from that? And I think before I turn to the panel, I think my colleague Felix has something he just wanted to sort of chip in on that question. So I'll open it to him.
Thanks, Ollie. Yeah, I would say the best example that came up during my conversations with people was in California, where they tried to introduce Buy Clean in 2016, 2017. There was a strong pushback from the cement industry in that state. And they didn't like any kind of regulations, that were kind of around, environmental carbon emissions, sustainability. And so there was a strong lobbying effort, which eventually got cement and concrete taken out of the final act, leaving steel and insulation and a few other materials. Since then, there's been efforts to try and add cement and concrete back in. I think those have been unsuccessful, although I'll defer to Meghan on the latest update on that. But the sort of lesson from that, I guess, was when I spoke to someone from Marin County, which is near San Francisco, they had a very successful engagement effort with the local cement and concrete industry, and were kind of more flexible around compliance pathways. And so we're able to pass a local Buy Clean code that included concrete. And so that's really, I think the lesson is, engage with industry early, be prepared to be flexible, be prepared to meet them halfway. And as Sarah said, in Canada, we are coming from a place of, I guess, more support at baseline than in places like California. I don't know if you had anything to add, Meghan, on California?
I don't think it's back in committee yet, but there is still an open bill to add concrete and cement to Buy Clean California.
Thanks, Felix. I don't know whether anyone else on the panel has anything to add on their experiences with reluctant industries.
I think I would maybe just say, so obviously the cement and concrete industry in Canada is very different. We're actually engaged in a process right now with the government of Canada where we will be, I think, among the first industry to submit all of our data and EPDs, both product and regional concrete EPDs as part of our data gathering, and are hoping to be amongst the first to develop, some procurement policies, standards, and codes around purchasing lower carbon concrete in at least government construction, if not more broadly. So I would say that there's a difference there. And I think, recalcitrant industries aren't really as much. It's important to learn from the United States, but we've also come a long way since Buy Clean California. And I think, one of the benefits that we've learned over the years, and one of the things that Canada has been able to enjoy from US leadership on this, is that most, if not all, of the industries in Canada that would be engaged in this conversation are very much coming from a position of yes, let's. So yes, we're on board. Let's figure out how we do this.
Yeah, and I maybe want to add to Sarah's point a little bit, is that I found that many industries want to be at the table, right? Because they have the materials and methods right now to lower the carbon footprint, and in some cases may have been doing this for many years without people asking for it on projects, or without people even knowing what they were getting, right? And so, we've seen a lot of industries saying, yes, how can we help? And I think one interesting angle that we've seen here in Oregon that would, I think, apply elsewhere, especially on the infrastructure side, is that we've found that, you know, buy clean policies that focus on carbon open the door a little bit into more performance-based specifications. And material manufacturers, contractors usually like performance-based specifications. And so that's a way to get more people on board, and they see an opening, because ultimately carbon is just yet another specification to make on a material. And so we've also found that messaging to be helpful to just simplify it. Look, this is just another spec for a material.
Yeah, the last thing I'll add to this is I think that the committees and other conversations I've been in related to buy clean, I've seen pushback from every single kind of industry. I wouldn't say that there's, you know, one that's pushing back and others aren't, but also support from all of those same groups. And I think lumping all of industry into one bucket, or even within a particular kind of material, is a mistake. And they have really different companies, depends on how large the company is, how vertically integrated they are. There's huge variation. And I also think it's important to distinguish between pushback and really constructive criticism. So one example would be, I think when Buy Clean California was originally passed, it just said there had to be a limit for steel. And steel is a breadth of products fit under steel. There's a lot of different kinds of steel. And so having one number for steel just doesn't make sense. And so the trade association was able to work with Department of General Services to provide constructive feedback on how they can make those more helpful categories to talk about steel. So I don't think you can have these policies without engagement and feedback from industry. And so I think it's really important that they're at the table, but it's not surprising that there's always going to be companies and groups that are for and against these types of policies.
Thanks. Really useful, you know, set of experiences across the board there. We've had a few questions that sort of look at trade and those kinds of areas. So I'll just pick one that I think sort of encapsulates it relatively well, which is, how does the panel think that buy clean policies may interact with Buy America, Buy American policies in the context of cross-border trade? It's open to anyone, but I don't know whether perhaps Sarah or Meghan in particular might have a viewpoint on this.
Maybe I'll just say, you know, Canada does a lot of exports to the United States, whether it be in, you know, cement or steel, aluminum, etc. Canada has a very good track record in terms of creating low carbon materials. And certainly we want to show our #1 trading partner that we can maintain and match their level of ambition and perhaps even exceed it as part of maintaining our positive and healthy trade relationship between the two jurisdictions.
The only thing I'll add here is just the caution against lumping different kinds of materials together. It really depends on the product that you're talking about. There's huge differences in how internationally traded and the imports and exports that are happening for the products that are included in buy clean. So steel compared to concrete, for example, massive differences. Cement maybe internationally more traded, but concrete products, a lot of it is quite local, and therefore has different constraints on it. And so sometimes when I see buy clean framed as a buy American policy, it just makes me question what materials are included in that policy. So we'll say.
Yeah, and the last thing I'd add is that, you know, there's a lot of complicated factors for how these policies can overlap or not. And, you know, I'd say to the extent that whether it be American or Canadian policies that help influence imports from other places in the world, that's always going to be a good thing, right? I mean, climate change is a global issue. We're going to continue trading across, borders. And so to the extent that anyone's procurement policy can help clean up industrial production from wherever these materials are coming from is a benefit to us all when we all have the same goal of mitigating climate change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Thank you. So we've had a question on the data. So Jordan, this might be one for you again. But again, encourage anyone to step in and answer, which is, are EPDs, so embodied product declarations, the answer, or should we consider full life cycle assessments, LCAs? And if LCAs are the gold standard, how far off are we from reliable data on for LCAs in general?
I mean, I'm not 100% sure I understand the question, because EPDs are formed on the basis of LCA. So I think, there's a reason why we use EPDs. I don't know, Megan, is there anything else maybe you want to add?
I'll just jump in quickly and say exactly what you just said. So EPDs are communicating the results of a life cycle assessment. I think what this question is getting at is whether additional life cycle stages beyond cradle to gate should be included. So EPDs focus on extraction through manufacturing. A lot of Buy Clean conversations I've heard are interested in other life cycle stages. I think we will continue to see that brought up and probably integrated over time. And I hope that happens through standards, and so that there's some agreement on how that could happen.
Yeah, I think I'll reflect a little bit on Oregon's Buy Clean policy that was recently passed. Will require that the Oregon Department of Transportation does do full life cycle assessment of a few pavement projects. And so whether we're talking about roads or buildings, full life cycle assessment, whether it be whole building life cycle assessment or pavement life cycle assessment, you'd be wanting to do that first, right? You'd be wanting to figure out, what your assemblies are or what your main structural materials are. Life cycle assessment is step one in the process. And then once you've actually chosen your materials, okay, we're going to go with a steel frame and a concrete foundation. That's when you then use EPDs to procure the lowest carbon material, right? And so a lot of times that's how the stepwise progression is going. We often see people jump right to EPDs because that's the easy thing on the market right now. That's easy to do. It's easy to accept, to access. So there's nothing wrong with just using EPDs to select the lowest carbon product. But ultimately, yes, we want to be using life cycle assessment more holistically to be designing roads and buildings to begin with, and then using EPDs to select the most efficiently produced products.
Great, thank you. Apologies on my part for perhaps butchering the question there. So thank you all for stepping in and giving some more clarity. So I think we're almost at time. So I'm going to finish with one question, one final question, which is for everyone on the panel that's come in, which is there a mechanism or mechanisms that you see that can encourage further innovation and raising ambition beyond thresholds that may be set in a Buy Clean policy?
Yes. So one that the one that I'll highlight was proposed in the Clean Futures Act. And so still potentially could develop as part of the federal Buy Clean program in the United States, is looking at having more than just one sort of value. So when we talk about limits in Buy Clean, we're often talking about a maximum. So what is the ceiling on what is the worst your product can be? But there's a huge opportunity to also say, what does a good product look like? And I think that what hopefully we'll start to see integrated over time into Buy Clean policies is to have both of those. And then the question is, what kind of incentive is being provided to encourage manufacturers to reach that lower number? Or are you just segmenting off a smaller number of products? So only certain projects have to meet those, or are you doing it through incentives? I think there's a number of different ways that could be achieved. But that's the one that I've seen proposed in a number of different ways. Sometimes that's talked about as having a label for better products, but essentially just saying, okay, here's the worst, but what's good? Let's hit for that.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the time, I'll maybe just say, so yes, like there's lots of different ways that you can do it, and you should do it, because innovation in industry often moves faster than standards in legislation, right? Like codes and standards can take anywhere from 2 to 5 years to develop, and frankly, we need to move, as Jordan said, like much faster than that. And so, looking at performance-based standards, even innovative policies we've seen in Europe around outcomes-based procurements, and really just encouraging and pushing industry to give its very best, I think are all things that should be looked at as part of Buy Clean policy.
Yeah, and I really like the idea of performance-based incentives. Right now, if you achieve a certain density of asphalt on your roadways, you get a financial bonus. If you finish your project early, you get financial bonuses. So why not the same for low carbon products on these types of projects? The other thing I'd say that I'm hopeful for is pairing some of these Buy Clean programs with other industrial efficiency programs. There are many out there, whether it be at the federal or state level. I think there's more opportunity there to pair these up.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry to be the one to come in and cut in on what is obviously an extremely engaged discussion. And I know there were some questions we didn't have a chance to get to, but I did want to have the chance to say thank you so much to our guests for participating in the discussion. Obviously, Senator Hansen, who's no longer with us, but Meghan, Lewis, Jordan Palmeri, and Sarah Petrevan, we really appreciate your time. And thank you so much for such great insight into Buy Clean policy. I will just flag at the end, all those who signed up today will be getting an email from us. Make sure you've signed up for the Clean Energy Review and complete the short survey. It will take less than 3 minutes, and share broadly with anyone who might be interested the recording or the presentation of today. And just thank you again so much to all the participants and all the presenters today. We really appreciate it, and have a great rest of your day.